All right, we're finally at the last menu, which is the green playback menu at the very bottom. So if we go to the very top, we have slideshow. I'm going to do a lot of different things with this. I can show you one method that I use, and it's about the only thing I do with this. You can do a slideshow of all, pictures only, video only, which is the one I use the most. So I could say start, and what's really cool about this is if I have a whole bunch of clips, let's say I've shot a whole bunch of stuff on a family vacation and I connected the camera up to the monitor and everybody wants to see what happened during the day, you can just hit play and it almost seamlessly goes from video clip to video clip. So even though you didn't do any editing, it has this kind of a nice experience and you can kind of watch it and see which clips you want to use. So let's get out of here, and if there's 3D, this is kind of weird. You actually have to put 3D files on there and watch it on a 3D television, so that's kind of an odd one. Category selection, you can actually do things that were taken in different picture modes, like scenery or food or whatever, the ones that I've never even used, but you can actually do them by category, or you can do them by favorite. So let's say you have been doing the favorite type thing, and then you want to just play back the favorites from that particular day. Kind of a cool choice. A big warning on this one can totally freak you out if you go in here and you select something other besides normal play. Because let's say you select pictures only. When you go to play back, with the regular play button on the camera, you're gonna see only pictures. And if you took a whole bunch of video, you're gonna freak out and you're like, where did all my videos go? Because if you've forgotten about that you made this selection. So if I were you, I would definitely leave that on normal play. Location logging. So if you're doing a lot of location scouting and you have your phone with you and you've got the Wi-Fi app turned on and you're using the camera and you're snapping pictures away and you want to capture the longitude and latitude so you remember exactly the location you were at when you were trying to, find the right scene or whatever you're trying to do, you can add that information. So if I click here, add location data, you'll see that right now I'm actually not using the phone in that capacity, but I could attach the longitude and latitude information so I can find that location later. Raw processing is grayed out. That's photography. Clear retouch, photography. Title edit, can only do in photography. Text stamp, photography. Video divide. Finally, we get to one we can talk about. If we go into the video divide, you can actually find a video you want and cut it. So let's say, for instance, an example would be you did this wonderful take and it's the first minute is good stuff, and then somebody forgot to turn the camera off and it recorded for like a half hour and it was like using up all of your, let's say, your card, your SD card, and you're like, well, I like that really good take, let's go ahead and divide it, and then we have the other minutes that we can just basically dump and delete. I would advise against it. Buy big cards would be a situation you might want to do. But the reason I say that is not with this camera, but I've done it with some Canon cameras where I've done this, and you've got it in the can, it's on the SD card, and if you haven't backed it up yet, I would advise not doing this, because if you do, there's a chance that something might go wrong during the writing to the file where it cut it, and it might corrupt things. So if it's a really good take, I would say advise against it. All right, moving down, we have time-lapse video grayed out, stop motion videos grayed out. We're gonna have a whole chapter on this. The reason they're grayed out right now is we're on a system frequency of 24. So we'll move down. We got all these are photography related, so we're gonna skip. Favorite, just another way, if you haven't assigned a button on the back of the camera to do this, you can actually deep into the menu, go into it like this, say single or multi, for instance, go to the actual image that you want, and then press it again, and then you can put a star on there. Press it again, takes the star away. Just one of the ways to do that. Print set photography, protect. You can protect video files, but like I said before, if you format the card, it's gone. Photography, and this last one, delete confirmation. This is really up to you, but I set it to yes first because I'm pretty cocky that way that I'm not going to accidentally do it. So let's go ahead and I'll demonstrate this for you. So if I hit the play button on the back of the camera, you'll notice when I hit the trash can button, I say delete single, the yes comes up first rather than no. So if you're doing this to many different images or video files, you'd have to move over to yes and then press the yes button, then it would throw it out. So that is the end of the menu section. All right, next up we're going to talk about exposure. Exposure is really important. There's probably one other thing that's more important than exposure, and that's focus. Focus, if you don't get it right, you can't change it later. Whereas like white balance or exposure, we can change it later in post. And if you're looking at my monitor and it looks curved, it's because it is. I've got a new monitor I'm testing right now, and it's precariously placed on some blocks of wood before I need to get a better mount for that. Anyway, a quick little story. This is a camcorder I bought years ago. It was great because I could set it on auto exposure, or I could set it on manual exposure, and I could actually increase or decrease exposure right on the touchscreen. Life was easy. Then I got one of these cameras. It's actually a Canon camera years ago, and I'm looking all over like, where does it say the word exposure like it did on my camcorder? I can't find it. How do I bring the brightness up or brightness down? How do I do that? So basically, you're not going to find the word exposure anywhere on this camera except for exposure compensation, which is photography only. So basically, I want to tell you, and we're going to be running through each one of these independently. There's 3 items that make up exposure that you can change exposure with, and that's ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. All right, before we start talking about the 3 different attributes that make up exposure, I want to talk about the light meter that's built in the camera because we're going to need that to demonstrate those 3 items. So looking at our camera here, you'll notice, actually let's move it over here in the center so you can see it better. Right at the bottom center of the screen, you'll see a plus or minus 0. That means based off of what we have, if we go into, remember our metering mode, we've got multi, center weighted, and spot. Let's keep it on center weighted average for right now. If we come out of here, it's basically the camera saying, in center weighted average mode, I'm looking at the scene, I think you are properly exposed. And again, center weighted average looks at kind of the center of the frame. It weights it more. It's looking at the corners of the frame, like in my frame right now. It's looking at those corners, but it's not putting as much weight into it. If we go to, for instance, multi, it's pretty much looking at the entire frame. And you're going to see that there's a little bit difference between that one, because right now it says we're a third of a stop over, versus center weighted average, where it says we're right on. Usually those two are within a third of a stop of each other. So what I want to demonstrate here is using the light meter with spot metering to get some really accurate exposure, especially if I were to replace that 18% gray card with an actual person's face. You would have a very good exposure, especially in the picture style that we're using now. And remember when we started with natural. So I'm going to be talking much more about picture styles, but I want to just show you really quickly is if I go up here to photo styles, sorry, sometimes I'll say picture styles because I'm coming from a Canon background, but it's called photo style. If I change through here, you're going to see actually the exposure change, especially when we get to Cine like D and Cine like V. You notice how it got darker. If I go ahead and hit enter, or set, you'll see that now we're 1/3 of a stop down, as before when we were in natural. Oops, there we go. You'll notice that we're right on. So Cine like D and Cine like V are slightly different. We're going to be dealing with more of those later, but if you're playing along at home with what I'm demonstrating, definitely start off with natural, because that's the easiest one to set up for 18% gray. Because if you're using some of the others, you might have to bump the exposure like a third of a stop in those situations. All right, really quick, just a quick demonstration. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. And so what we've got, let's say we've got that 18% gray card as somebody's face. And which is a lot of times what will happen is I'll set a card up like this before the actor, the talent, or whatever gets there. And then when they get there, I've got it properly exposed. Even the white balance set, which we'll talk about more, and we'll get focus and everything. Because like I said, all you have to do is just take your finger and move it over to like that target part, and it's going to grab focus on it, which is a very powerful tool. So I'm going to go back into the menu, and let's go back down to metering, and we'll put this to spot. Now what's really cool about this is you can see that we're set at the light meter saying we're properly exposed. But watch what happens when I take my finger and I move it over to where the snow is. Actually, I think the snow's down here. And release. Now you'll say, whoa, the light meter thinks I'm probably even above 3 stops over, well above. So what's really powerful tool here is when in a situation where you are using a light meter, which is something I don't use that much. The only time I ever use it is with an 18% gray card. because we've got like 5 different exposure tools we'll be covering. And this first one is the light meter. And then we could just take it and drag it over here onto the 18% gray card, and boom, you could say, hey, we've got a properly exposed image. I want to quickly show the relationships between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture really quick using this 18% gray card, so you can kind of get a feel what's going on, I guess, mathematically. Each stop is basically a doubling. So if I take my ISO button, and you can see right now we're at ISO 400, and you can see that each individual number, you go from 200, 400, 800, and see how it's doubling? That's each time it doubles, that's a stop. And then you see those minor tick marks in between. And remember, we set our camera up to be able to do 1/3 increments for ISO. So if I rotate the front dial, you're going to see it actually change from, so it goes 1, 2, 3. So one stop has 3 basically clicks, I guess you could call it. What we're going to do right now is, we'll notice that the light meter is saying we're properly exposed for this image. What I'm going to do is I'm going to raise this let's do that again. 1, 2, 3. So we're going up a full stop. And if I go out and I look at it, sure enough, it says I am gone up 1 complete stop, because you can see there's 3 little hash marks or ticks in that light meter. So what I do now is I've raised the ISO up 1 stop. Well, let's say I want to bring it down in a different way. I'm going to do that with shutter speed. Right now, next to that 4.5 on the right hand side, you see a 50th of a second. It doesn't say 1/50th, they just write it 50, but it's 50th of a second. So if I change that and I increase that from 50th to 60, 80, and then 100, I've raised the shutter basically 1 stop. And therefore, you can see I've then gotten back down to my base neutral exposure. All right, let's demonstrate this one other way. Let's go ahead and reset our shutter speed back to 50th of a second. And what I'm going to do now is, you see that, oh, we're a stop over. What I'm going to do now is take my aperture, the front dial, and I'm going to increase that 1, 2, 3. And look at that. So we got this nice mathematical, I guess you could say, triangle going on here between the relationship of all 3. So there's going to be a lot of situations like, I need another stop of light, but I don't want to use the ISO. I want to use the shutter speed. How do I do it? And using the light meter in the camera with an 18% gray card is a fantastic tool for us to do this. All right, next up we're going to talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is by far the easiest thing to grasp in terms of exposure, and we could pretty much take it out of the equation. So we only have to deal with 2 other items in terms of dealing with exposure, which is great. This camera has a really cool feature in it, which we're going to show, which you can pretty much just set it and forget it, which is fantastic, unless you're looking for a different amount of motion blur in your image. So what is shutter speed? This camera is not a DSLR, doesn't have a mirror in it, which is fantastic for video. There's basically 2 different types. There's the mechanical shutter that you might be used to in photography mode, where it will basically close and open to gather light. And you might have heard like the mechanical shutter when you're doing a burst, it's like really fast. And that's that shutter going up and down really fast. Then there's the other type, which is an electronic shutter. And that's what we use in video. So we got to talk about different shutter speeds. I basically used 2 different shutter speeds. And actually, we're actually going to change this all up. And we're actually only going to use one thing, and that's the shutter angle. If we set it to 180 degrees on our shutter angle, we pretty much don't have to do anything, which is a fantastic tool. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. So what is the 180 degree rule? As you can see here, I've got kind of a primitive setup where I've got a hole in the piece of paper. You can think of that hole as a sensor in your camera. And you could think of that spinning CD as a rotating shutter. And what you'll notice is the CD is chopped in half. So basically, if you had a whole entire CD, that would be 360 degrees. But since we're cutting it in half, there's only 180 degrees of rotation that can happen when it passes the sensor. So this is what's called the 180 degree rule. And from what I understand, I've never seen one of these cameras. It's probably, I don't even know if they're around anymore, but they used to have rotating shutters inside of it, like that spinning CD, and allowed for a certain amount of motion blur. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to explain on the photography side of things, we've got shutter speed, but we have a really powerful tool in here. It's called shutter angle, and we're going to be setting our camera up to that now. up to this point, we've kept it at shutter speed just to keep things easy. So basically, let's go ahead and take a look at what we got here. If I go into the menu, I've got variable frame rate turned on, and I'm at 1080 right now, and I'm going to hit set. And right now you can see I'm at 24 frames per second. And you'll see down in the lower left-hand corner-ish, you'll see 50 written. Well, it's 1/50. That means it's 50th of a second. So basically what happens is you basically want to double your frame rate. So if we go back up here and we look at our frame rate, what we're set to, you can see where it's 24p. So we want to double that number. So that's 48. Well, there is no 48th of a second, so we've chosen 50. And likewise, if we were to go to variable frame rate, go to set, if I were to bump this all the way up to 60, let's say, and then we'd go back to our shutter speed on our back dial and we'd rotate this to 125th because there's no 120. So basically the rule is you'll double your frame rate to get your shutter speed. Well, on this camera, there's something really cool, makes it totally easy, and that is what's called shutter angle. So I want you to go all the way down to page 6 of your menu. Went to a little farther. So there's what we're in right now is seconds in ISO, or shutter speed in terms of seconds, but we can go to shutter angle. So I want you to choose that one, and then go all the way back up, page 2, variable frame rate, go to set. Just to check, we're at 60 frames per second. So let's go ahead and look at the gray chart right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make this so it looks, I'm going to raise the ISO up 2/3 of a stop to make it even. You can see now our meter saying, hey, you're dead on for the 18% gray card. You'll notice that in the lower left-hand corner-ish, it says 180D. The D is for degrees. So what's great about this is I don't have to do any math anymore. I can just set it on that and just leave it there, which is just fantastic. And let me show you. So I'm going to go back into the menu and go to variable frame. I want to go ahead and set. Right now we're at 60 frames per second, which is great for slow motion. But I'm going to bring it down to 24 frames a second, which is kind of normal shooting that you would do, let's say, in 4K. And now take a look at that. Look at the meter. It automatically went up because it said, okay, if you're doing that, I'm going to change the shutter speed or the shutter angle for you to keep it in with that 180-degree rule. So it automatically got brighter. And then likewise, if I were to go here and go set, and I would go all the way to, let's say, 96 frames per second, it automatically changed the exposure and got darker on us. And you can see on the meter here, now we're 2/3 of a stop down. So the beauty of this is we don't have to do any math in our head. We don't have to do anything when we go from like regular motion, like 4K shooting, to like a slow motion type thing that you want to do, which is just fantastic. I want to demonstrate two different extreme shutter speeds. The first one's normal, and the first one's going to be really, really fast shutter speed to demonstrate what's going on here. So here I am in my backyard golfing. I'm not a very good golfer. This is 1080, 24 frames per second, and this is a 50th of a second. So when I want to look at my golf swing, and when I stop and I pause the golf swing, you'll notice that the golf swing, basically, you can't see the club at all. It's totally gone. There's so much motion blur that it's traveling so fast that you don't even see it. So let's do this again. Again, it's a 1080 clip, 24 frames per second, but this time I've increased the shutter speed to 1,000ths of a second, really, really fast. So now when we stop my swing, you'll notice that you can see the whole entire club. So there's two very different examples. Another example I want to show you is just water coming out of arcing out of a water fountain. And this is a great example. I think it's something that you should definitely go out and the next time you find a water fountain, just point your camera at it and try different shutter speeds, and then come back later and look at your footage and notice how you'll see a continuous stream when the shutter speed is very slow, or in this case, like what I'm showing is a higher shutter speed, you'll see a lot of dots, droplets in the water. And the last thing I want to say about shutter speed is there really is no right or wrong shutter speed or shutter angle. If it's a 180-degree rule, go ahead and break it once you understand what it's doing. So I can give you two examples of when to break the rule. The first rule is if you want your audience to feel a certain way, perhaps you want them to feel edgy in a jarring kind of scene. Maybe it's an action scene. Maybe go ahead and raise your shutter speed up to like 3/100ths of a second, and it'll give that kind of edgy staccato look to it. Or on the other extreme, let's say you're doing an interview and you've got a frame very similar to what this is, just basically a talking head. And let's say the person's not flailing their hands around a whole bunch. Well, go ahead and decrease it down to a 40th or even a 30th of a second to allow more light to come in. So let's say instead of bumping your ISO 2/3 of a stop higher and adding more noise, which we'll talk more about later, you can actually decrease it down to a 30th of a second because a talking head, there's not much motion in the frame at all. So you can do that as well. All right, let's talk about ISO next. So what is ISO? ISO is a measurement of your camera's sensitivity to light. So what does all that mean? So best way I can describe it is kind of an analogy. And basically what happens like when you press the ISO button and you go from ISO, let's say 200 all the way up to 6400. As we can see, it gets brighter. But what basically is happening is just like in an amplifier. Let's say you're listening to some music in your living room, very softly, background kind of music. You hit pause, you put your ear all the way up to the speaker, and then you can faintly just kind of hear a little bit of, just a little bit of hiss. Then you turn your amplifier way up while you're rocking out to the music. You hit pause again, walk up to the speaker and put your ear up to it, and you can hear psh a lot louder. So basically, it's very similar. What's going on in the sensor in the camera is very similar to what goes on in an amplifier in your stereo system. As you turn it up, you get louder, but you also get more noise. And when we turn this up, it gets brighter, but as a side effect, we get more noise as well. Of the three different elements that make up exposure, ISO is pretty much the only one that can degrade your image. Since we've already got the shutter speed pretty much set and we can kind of forget it for the most part unless you're trying to get a different type of motion blur, we basically have two elements left, ISO and aperture. In terms of which one do you set first, I would almost recommend setting the ISO first before you set the aperture. Because depending on the situation, you basically want it to be the lowest possible so we don't have noise to contend with. All right, if you're one of the few people that maybe actually took my suggestion after the very first video in this course and took it out and played with it in fully automatic mode, you would have been in auto ISO mode. And you probably noticed that after you've shot for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, brought some of that footage into your nonlinear editor and looked at it and you're like, man, some of the shots were really, really noisy. Why? Well, basically, the camera just doesn't really care where it's set to. It just wants to get a properly exposed image, and it might think that I see a person in the frame, maybe I want a higher f-stop number, the camera said, but to do that, I'm gonna have to really crank up the ISO, and it might have brought the ISO all the way up to 6400 and just made your image very noisy. So I think that's a great experiment if you did do it and experience that. But basically what we're gonna try to do is bring the ISO as low as we can for the given lighting situation. All right, if you didn't know already by now, this is a micro four thirds sensor, which is a smaller sensor compared to a full frame sensor. A full frame sensor is basically like 4 times as big. So you could take 4 of these sensors and put them on top of a full frame sensor. So what does that mean? It basically means that this camera doesn't do as well in low light in terms of noise. So kind of a general guideline, what this camera does at ISO 1600 is very comparable what a full frame camera would do at ISO 6400. I think we all know that as you increase the ISO, you're going to get more noise. But as you increase the ISO, you can also play around with the colors. Basically, you're degrading the colors as you go higher in the ISO. And I want to just quickly demonstrate that for you. Actually, on the left-hand side, I'm going to do a kind of a vertical shift across the image. On your left-hand side, you're going to see ISO 6400, and on the right-hand side is going to be ISO 200. And I'll tell you when they get to each stopping point, because it might be a little bit hard to see. So we're going to start right now. Here's the first one. Again, ISO 6400 on the left. Here comes the second one. ISO 200 on the right. Here comes the third one. Here comes the fourth one. Here comes the fifth one. And here comes the 6th one. So one of the benefits in shooting in 4K and downscaling to 1080, which is something I do pretty much all the time, which is a great advantage, is your noise that started off at 4K and then downscaled, the noise basically gets smaller. So I want to go ahead and demonstrate that for you right now. It's going to be hard. I'm going to show you 2 different clips. We'll do 4K first and we'll do 1080, and then we'll zoom in so you can actually see it. Because if you're watching this like on a mobile device, maybe you're watching it on a smaller screen, what's going to happen is you're not going to be able to see the amount of noise that I'm seeing here on my screen. So start off, here we go. This is 4K image, 6400. Here's 1080 at 6400. Here's 4K zoomed in over my shoulder. And coming up is the 1080, which is noisier, at least that I can see on my screen. Again, it's hard because we're going to be, I compress this and then I bring it up to the web and then you actually watch it. So there's other artifacts going on that you're not seeing that I can see here on the screen. But yes, if you take a 4K image, you downscale it to 1080, the noise basically gets smaller, and that's definitely a benefit for a 4K camera. All right, you might be asking, why is there no ISO 100? Because when you're in photography mode, you can go to ISO 100, and in video mode, you can't. I have a theory. I don't know if it's correct or not. I haven't talked to the Panasonic engineers, but I have heard Panasonic talk about how ISO 800 is the native or base ISO for this camera. And basically what that means is the engineers have said, you know, we've run a lot of tests on this, and ISO 800, you're going to get the best or the largest amount of dynamic range out of this camera. But if you go to ISO 200, you might not. And I have a feeling the reason they don't have an ISO 100 is maybe the dynamic range degrades so much that they were like, let's just leave it out and not even put it in there. That's just my theory. So would I recommend shooting ISO 800 over 200? I think you'll notice if you play around with these two and you shoot a high dynamic range scene, you're not going to see that much difference at all. In fact, it's negligible. I don't think I've ever even noticed a difference between ISO 800 and 200 in terms of dynamic range, but you will notice a difference between 800 and 200 in terms of noise. So if I were you, if you're in a certain situation, I would leave it at the lowest value you can, which would be ISO 200 in our case. So you might be asking, Dave, where do I set my ISO? It's a really good question, and I really can't answer it, unfortunately. I can give you some guidelines, though. So if, let's say you're outside, Colorado, beautiful sunny day, ISO 200, all day long. Just keep it there. And then adjust your aperture to wherever you need to set your exposure that way. Let's say you're kind of in shade outside, maybe under a tree. You might be between like 250, 320, and 400. That might be a guess. Again, this I don't know because it depends on your situation, what the shade is, if it's the shade of a building, what's reflecting light around. Let's say now you're moving inside and you're in an area where it has mixed lighting. You got some light coming in and you got some lights. You might be between 400 and let's say 800. Now let's say it's getting darker outside or you're inside, it's late in the evening and you're really starting to push the ISO and you're going to, let's say, 1600. And this is pretty much where I stop. I don't like to go any higher than 1600 because it gets quite noisy. You get to 3200, 6400, you're definitely going to notice a lot of noise. So I would definitely stay in the 1600 or lower range. In fact, most of the stuff I do is below 1000. I try to, try to light the situation as best you can. This is not a full frame camera. This is a wonderful device, but you are going to need some lights. Like I've got a lot of light coming in from outside, but I've got 2 soft boxes set up right here, which I do for full frame cameras anyway. But yeah, I would really advise staying 1600 or lower. I would try, if you can, set up lights and don't go any higher than 800 is my suggestion. All right, if you've been shooting with the GH4 for a while at high ISOs like 1600, 3200, 6400, you might have noticed that some images look clean while others look really noisy. And so let me see if I can give you some recommendations. Before I do, let's kind of show you what looks clean and what looks not so clean. So here's a pretty clean image. This is shot at ISO 6400 down in my studio with a black background. Now what you'll notice with the black is quite black. It's almost all the way to 0 on the IRE scale, if you know what IRE is on a scope. The image itself looks pretty good. You'll notice that like these patches of black, and that's where you're going to notice the most amount of noise is in the darker areas. You're not going to notice it in the really light areas, but usually like you can see it in this area. Next up is a pure white background, totally lit. I've got the same amount of light on me as before, but a lot of it's bleeding around me. This is the same thing. It's shot at ISO 6400, and you'll notice that it looks pretty darn clean because that background, which is a lot of the image, is totally blown out. So it's like 255 or like 100 on your IRE scale, totally blown out. There's not much place for that noise to live if it's like has no detail. It's totally blown out. And which is really interesting too, is if you crush your blacks or you blow out your whites like we're doing here, and you render out a file versus not crushing them or blowing them out and letting that noise kind of live in that area, your file size will actually go down when you do this type of procedure, let it blow out or let it go totally black. Next up, I want to show you, now my background is pretty much at 50 IRE, right in the middle. It's like middle gray, I guess you could call it. And you'll notice that you can see some, but it's not too bad. But where the noise really rears its ugly head is in this situation where we've got over my left shoulder, you kind of see there's a gradient going from black off to my right shoulder to the left, or going to the right side of the screen, it gets lighter. And right off to my left shoulder, it has about where the most noise lives. And that's in the like 10 to 15 IRE range. If you're, like I said before, if you know scopes pretty well. If you don't know what scopes are, maybe I can describe it a little bit better, give you kind of an indication, because I've taken files from here, looked at the histogram and brought them in, try to match it up. So right here we have a very dark scene. I'm actually at f22. I've changed my shutter angle to be very dark, and I'm shooting at ISO 6400. And where that noise lives the most is, you can see on the histogram as I'm moving it around, that 10 to 15 IRE is kind of like in this area right here. So my suggestion to you is, if you're going to shoot at a high ISO like 1600, 3200, 6400, which I don't really recommend, but if you have to do it, kind of make it in a situation where most of your pixels in your frame are not living in that 10 to 15 IRE range. One final thought on ISO is noise reduction. In your nonlinear editor, or you can get a third-party plugin, like let's say Neat Video for instance, you can actually remove some of that noise. So if you shot it at a high ISO and it's really noisy, you could take some of it out to make it somewhat acceptable. But there's a couple things to think about. One is it increases your render time huge. It's a very CPU intensive tasks. So you're going to need a really beefy computer. You're going to need a lot of time in post because it's going to increase the render times. It's going to make your playback hell when you're editing, because it's one of the things you're going to have to do at the very end. My best advice here is not to use it at all. Shoot at a lower ISO and bring some lights in, especially for a Micro Four Thirds camera. You're definitely going to want to use some lights to supplement, unless you're outside. To bring that ISO as down as far as you can and get a nice clean image. All right, before we move on to aperture, let's recap really quickly. So shutter speed or shutter angle does basically two things for you. The first item is brightness, how bright it gets or dark it gets. And the second one is more of a creative element, which is how much motion blur you want in your shot. ISO basically does two things as well. It changes your brightness, exposure, but it also has the noise element in it as well that you need to watch out for. And the last item we're going to talk about is aperture. So what is aperture? Basically, aperture is how much light is allowed through a hole or an opening, like in your lens. So where it's a pretty easy concept, but where it gets really confusing is the f-stop numbers, which is the measurement of how wide or closed that aperture is. So basically what we're going to do is to clarify this confusion. If you're coming from photography, you probably all already know this, but if you came from, let's say, a camcorder background and you're like, have no idea what f-stop numbers are, because you might think, well, f-stop f22 means it's big. That means the opening is really big. Or you could be thinking of f2.8 as being like really small. Well, it's not that, it's the opposite. The best way I can describe it to you is a swimming pool example, where you have an infinity swimming pool where you have a very shallow end on one side that's maybe 2.8 inches deep. And then on the other side of the swimming pool, we've got a F16 or 16 feet deep pool. So you're thinking about in terms of the amount of depth of focus that we're talking about here, because that's basically what this is going to be controlling, is how much is going to be in focus. So think of the shallow end of the swimming pool as being a very narrow or thin depth of focus, and think of the F16, the very deep end of the pool, like everything is in focus. To demonstrate depth of field or depth of focus, the way I like to call it, because really it is, that's how deep the focus is. Right now in the lower left-hand corner, you can see I'm at f2.8, and I'm kind of moving it around, and you can see I've got focus peaking turned on. You can see that blue area, and that's what's in focus. And you can see it's really thin. There's a thin amount of items in here that are in focus. So this is a great way to demonstrate what the difference between f2.8 is to, let's say, f8. f8, there's a bit more in focus, as you can see, around that blue area that's in focus. Now if we move all the way to f22, you can see the blue focus peaking area is kind of died down a bit, because it's saying, hey, just about everything in the frame is in focus, so I'm not going to show you everything. So you can see right in the middle of the measuring tape where I'm moving it around, you can kind of see that area that's in focus. So basically what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that f2.8, even though it's a smaller number, means that you have less in focus. Just think of the swimming pool. I think that's a great way to think about it. So I want to talk about three different terms I might be using and want to explain what they are. It's wide open, meaning the aperture is wide open, so it would be like a f2.8 in this case. Stopping down, meaning I'm bringing that iris down to its smallest pinpoint hole opening. That's referred to as stopping down. And the last term I might use is what's called fast glass. Now fast glass is typically something like 2.8 and is constant throughout the entire zoom range. So this lens that comes with the camera, if you bought it as a kit, the 12 to 35 lens, is a constant aperture 2.8. That means no matter where you zoom to, it'll always stay at 2.8 if you want to leave it there. There's other lenses that usually are cheaper and perhaps sometimes lighter, that will be not constant aperture. So let's say I was at like 12 millimeters and I was at f2.8. When I would zoom to 35 millimeters, that might clamp down to, let's say, 5.6. And usually fast glass is usually very expensive, so that you can usually tell the difference between the two. Also, when you get into primes that do not have any zooming capability, they also are typically very fast in terms of like going down to f 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. All right, I want to deviate from aperture just a little bit. I want to talk about crop factor and the relationship of this lens and to this sensor in comparison to a full frame. Because full frame, that's where you'll see the actual numbers in millimeters of like a zoom, for instance. Like this lens is 12 to 35, and that's what it is, but a lot of people will say it's equivalent to a 24 to 70. And that's because this sensor in here is a lot smaller than a full frame sensor, and it has what's called a 2x crop. So basically you multiply everything by 2x. So this 12 to 12 on the wide side becomes 24, and the 35 on this side becomes 70. Likewise, if you have a 70 to 200 lens on the full frame, that would be a 35 to 100 on a micro four thirds. All right, when we're shooting video, there's an additional crop factor to actually take into consideration. So when we're shooting 4K video on this, which is wonderful, because it crops in on the sensor a little bit so it can do a full pixel readout, and so we don't have any aliasing moire. So what happens is this 12 millimeter doesn't become a 24 millimeter, it becomes more like between a 27 and a 28 millimeter. Since the full frame camera is somewhat of a standard, especially when it comes to like the zoom ranges of different lenses like we talked about, I want to compare the micro four thirds sensor in this camera to a full frame sensor, like let's say in the Canon 5D Mark III. And if we look at this right here, you can see on the left hand side we have the Panasonic with the 12 to 35 at 35 millimeters, and it's at f2.8. Now on the right hand side we have the Tamron on the 5D Mark III, and it's at 70 millimeters, so it's basically the equal distance, because maybe you have to double it because of the crop factor. And it's also at f2.8. Now what you'll notice, a really good way of measuring how things are out of focus is using bokeh balls. So I focused on the doll's eyes, and basically the Christmas lights in the background become more and more out of focus. Like on the 5D Mark III, you can see the bokeh balls are larger, maybe over twice as big as what's going on the Panasonic side of things. So to demonstrate this, on the left-hand side at 2.8, we have these small bokeh balls from the GH4, and the 5D Mark III at 2.8 are a lot larger. So to see where they kind of get equal, I am stopping down on the 5D Mark III to find out where they're somewhat equivalent. And once we get to 5.6, which is coming up right here, you'll notice they're approximately the same size. To give you an example of the differences between the Micro Four Thirds and a full frame, we'll look at a gymnastics meet. Both of these were shot at f3.2, and this first one up, and as you can see, is all out of focus right here, is the Canon 5D Mark III. And I didn't focus until right about here at the end of the balance beam of the dismount. Now looking at the GH4, you'll notice it's already in focus, same f3.2, but when she travels the whole entire length of the balance beam, including the dismount, you'll notice that it's all in focus. And here's a side-by-side comparison. As you can see, we're getting a lot more things in focus with the GH4 compared to the 5D Mark III at the equivalent f-stop number. So if you're coming from a full frame background and you understand what f2.8 is like, f2.8 on this is not, like we said, similar to f2.8 on a full frame camera. The f2.8 on this, which is as fast as this lens will go, fast glass, it'll be equivalent to about a 5.6 on a full frame. So that means more things will be in focus with this camera. So you might be saying, Dave, I want the full frame look. I want my bokeh balls to be as big as a full frame. Well, you can kind of get there, but it takes a little bit of work. So on the right-hand side, we have a Tamron 24-70 at 2.8. And on the left-hand side, we have a Sigma Art lens 35 millimeter at 1.4 using a speed booster wide open. And as you can see, the bokeh balls on these are pretty similar, but we are not shooting at f2.8, we're shooting at 1.4. Now in this example, we see here on the left-hand side, I'm using a speed booster, and both are at 35 millimeters at f1.4 using actually the same exact lens. The red Epic is on the right-hand side, and the GH4 is on the left. And if you look at the Christmas lights in the background, you'll notice that they're pretty darn similar. So in terms of what Hollywood shoots with is usually what's called a super 35 millimeter sensor, which is smaller than a full frame sensor. So if you're looking for that cinematic Hollywood type of look, you can get there by using a speed booster and a fast piece of glass attached to it. Now, if you don't want to use a speed booster, but you still want to get that super shallow depth of field for that cinematic look, you can get a lens like this one, this Voigtlander 42.5. Again, we're doubling things, so that's actually an 85 millimeter equivalent, which is a very common like portrait lens, which would be great for interviews. It's kind of expensive. This particular lens does not have any sort of autofocus, but if you wanted to, you can get, Panasonic does make some very fast glass, not as fast as this one. It goes down to 1.2, but it can still give you a very cinematic look. Now, if you own this 12 to 35 millimeter lens, I got some good news for you and I got some bad news for you. The good news, which is pretty good, is like, and you're going to be shooting at f2.8 a lot because, like I said before, it's very similar to 5.6 on the full frame side of things, is it's very sharp. Not that much vignetting. Usually when you get to the lowest or wide open aperture on a lens, that's usually where it's weakest. Well, it's pretty strong here, and that's the fantastic part of it. But when you change it to all the way to f22, then it becomes weak. So let me demonstrate this to you. So on the left-hand side, we have f2.8, and on the right, f22. And as you can see, as this vertical swipe moves along the trees right now, and it's starting to come back to the other side, you'll notice that f2.8 is so much sharper than f22. Now, if we're going to compare, let's compare f8 to f22, where f8 should be the sharpest part of the lens. And sure enough, you can see a noticeable difference between f22 being very dull and f8 being very sharp. And this is all shot in 4K. So we compare it. Let's go here. Here's f22. And then what we're going to do is zoom in. And you can see that everything, it's almost like our 4K image has gone from being 4K to being like 720. We've lost resolution. It's gotten kind of dull image. But when we go to f8, here's f8, and we'll go ahead and zoom in. Then it looks all very sharp at 4K. And then as we pan up here through the 4K image, this is a 4K image and all I'm doing is panning through the 4K image, we can see that f8 is much, much sharper than f22. And here is f22 again, going all the way in, and you can just see how much duller it is compared to f8. So yes, that's a problem, but there is a fix, and that's what's called an ND filter. A while back I used to use a lot of variable NDs, and I've actually gotten away from them, and I'm using just one. This is a Tiffin density of 1.2. So I believe, if I remember correctly, it has about a 6-stop decrease in light. So instead of shooting at f22, I put this thing on, it might be all the way down to like f5.6 or even lower. It decreases the amount of light tremendously when you're in an outdoor situation. You can get other ones like a 0.9 that is not so aggressive in terms of dimming down your exposure. But what happens is you screw this on the front of your lens, and it's kind of like sunglasses for your lens. So basically, instead of shooting at f22, you can shoot at a lot lower f-stop number and still remain that really crisp, sharp image. So you might be asking, Dave, what f-stop number should I shoot at? Well, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. Let's say you're using this particular lens, the 12 to 35, and you're doing, let's say, an interview. I would shoot it wide open, f2.8. That'll give the person that's in the chair, you're doing an interview, or you have an actress and they're not moving around that much, I would definitely 2.8, because again, that's more like 5.6. And it gives them some room to move a little bit, but not too much. And so I think it'd be 2.8 is great for an interview situation. So if you're outside, let's say you're on a glide cam type of device, or like a Movi type of device or something like that, and you want to have everything in focus because you have no way of focusing, then shoot it like f8. Again, I wouldn't go to f22. Shoot f8 with like an ND filter. That would be a much better option. So you might be asking, well, because there's a lot of relationships going on here between how far you're zoomed, where your subject is. There's a lot of different things that come into play, and the best thing I can recommend is there's some wonderful free apps in the App Store, depending on what OIS you're on, or Android. I'm sure there's one in both that you can get something for free. This app is from lenstutorial.com. There's a lot of free ones in the App Store. So if we take this distance from the subject from 5 feet, there's 9, 12, 15, all the way to 20, you can see that the depth of field increases. Now we're decreasing the depth of field, or depth of focus. Then if we take this number, which is our zoom, and this is actually for the GH3 camera. They didn't have the GH4 in this particular app, but you can move on this particular lens, you can go all the way up to 96 millimeters, and you can see what's happening to the depth of focus. Then if we change the aperture, again, if we're all the way at 2.8, it's very shallow. And if we move it to f16, it's much bigger. And it can give you all those distances and everything in the app. So if you're in a situation where you don't know, you're just getting acquainted with that lens and this particular camera, download one of the apps and say, well, I'm going to be doing an interview and I know the person is going to be moving around about so much. And not even using an app, probably the best thing I would say, one of the things that I do, especially in an interview, is I'll say, okay, sit down, I'll set focus, and then I'll punch in just on their eye, and I'll tell them to lean in like they're gonna normally lean in, and I'm gonna see if they go out of focus. And then I'm gonna say, okay, why don't you lean back like you're contemplating something, and still zoomed in on their eye, and see if I'm still in focus, so I have that depth of focus done correctly. If they start going out, then I'll increase it. Let's say I'm at 2.8, then I'll increase it to like 3.2. We've talked about all the different things that make up exposure, but how do you set exposure? And that's what we're going to cover next. Basically, there's 5 different tools in the camera that we can use to get a properly exposed image. All right, the first tool at our disposal is the light meter. We've already demonstrated this already. This is kind of the situation where if you have lots of time, you have an 18% gray card, it's fantastic. I know not every single time you're going to be able to put a gray card in front of the camera like this and say, oh, I have a properly exposed image. Fantastic. You're not going to have that kind of time. So we're going to show other tools as well. And remember with this one, if you can't fill the frame, another way to do this is to put it on spot metering and just spot meter if this is off in the distance, and then you can look at the light meter to get your properly exposed image. The second tool we have at our disposal, which we've already demonstrated, is the histogram. As we can see here, if I take this 18% gray card and I put it in front of the frame and fill the frame, you can see that it's creating a spike right in the middle of the histogram, which tells me that I'm properly exposed for the image as well. One of the things I've done is I've assigned the histogram to my FN1 button, so I can toggle it on and off quite easily. The third tool that we have at our disposal is what I call the blinkies, which is also called highlight in the menu. And it's just basically something I don't use that often, like I said before. And as we can see here, it tells you where in the image is blinking, but this is only in playback mode. So you could record something, hit play, and then you could see where you're going wrong in the image. The fourth tool at our disposal is the zebras, which is just fantastic. And again, I've assigned it to the trash can button. And if I just go ahead and hit it here, you can see all of the area that is overexposed, has no detail, and it shows you where in the image. This is not in playback mode. This is before you start hit record, which is fantastic. And if we do hit record, you can see that they're also there as well. So as you're shooting, you know exactly where in the image is being overexposed. And even while you're recording, you can hit that trash can button and you can turn the zebras off if they're getting in your way. All right, next up I want to show you the difference between using the zebras versus the light meter as an exposure tool. So here I am up in Essex Park, Colorado, and what I want you to notice is the foreground looks good, the trees look good, the mountain looks good, the sky looks okay, but what happens in the upper left-hand corner, we can see that cloud is blowing out. We're losing detail in that cloud. But yet the light meter on the camera said everything was properly exposed. It was right in the middle. Now what I want to show you is a slightly darker image, but you'll notice this time instead of using the light meter, I used the zebras. And the zebras told me I was not losing any detail in the cloud because I kept bringing down the exposure until all the zebras went away in the cloud. But what you'll notice is now the foreground looks pretty dark, the trees look dark. So now what I did is I brought that into post, actually into speed grade, and I basically lifted the midtones. And this is what it looks like after I lifted the midtones. So the foreground looks good, the trees look good, and now the cloud looks good as well. And if we were to compare that to our original shot, you can see that it's pretty much the same, but in this case, we're losing detail in the clouds versus the final shot where we have all that information in the clouds. So sometimes using zebras is good to protect something in an image, especially landscapes is a perfect example. To protect something in an image that you don't want to blow out. And then later on, mentally you know that you can correct some of the other parts of the exposure in post. All right, and the fifth and final tool is using your eyes on the screen. And this is probably the most important tool that you've got going for you. So maybe you have ballparked it in terms of the light meter. You've turned on, let's say, the histogram, and you can see what's going on there. You've turned on the zebras. You can see what's going on there as well. But ultimately, what you want to do, let's turn all that stuff off. But what I want to do is punch in. So we're going to go ahead and punch in like we've done before. And this is probably the most powerful tool. So like you're setting up for an interview and you do have a lot of backlight coming in like we do in this case. And you want to make sure that the skin, you want to retain that information in the skin, because our background I don't care about. If I blow it out, I blow it out. But I don't want to lose detail on the person's skin. So this is a fantastic tool. So you can basically cursor around and check to see if I'm losing any detail. And as you can see, I'm not losing any detail in her plastic skin. So this is the fifth and final tool. So use your other tools to get you close, and then I would say use this tool at the very end. If you have an important shot like an interview, punch in, look around the part of the image that you want to protect. And again, like I said, if you don't want to, like in that last example where the cloud is, if you didn't care if the cloud is blown out, go ahead and blow it out. And if you're only interested in the trees, then just concentrate on the trees. But in this case, with the doll, I'd say definitely zoom in, look around the image, find out where you're blowing out, and then adjust your exposure accordingly. So one tip I can give you about exposure, when you're shooting things like B-roll, where you don't have talent in the frame, let's say you're doing a story on a particular grocery store, for instance, you need to go grab some B-roll of it, so you go outside and you run a few seconds of B-roll. Well, in that case, the tip I can give you is definitely play around with the exposure, because you're only going to record maybe 10 seconds, then you might only use just 2 or 3 seconds in your actual story. Well, go ahead and play around with the exposure. Put it where the light meter says to put it. Use your zebras. What I would say is you want to go 1 or maybe 2/3 of the stop higher and maybe 1 or 2/3 of a stop lower. So if you can afford it, instead of recording one 10-second clip, record like 3 10-second clips, maybe 1/3 a stop over and 1/3 of the stop under. And that way, when you bring stuff back in post and you do this over and over again as you create your stories or whatever you're creating, you'll get to know which one you start picking the most. It's like I always pick the one that's 1/3 of the stop over. So as you start shooting more and more, you might not have to do the exercise. Maybe just go out and shoot one 10-second clip at 1/3 of the stop over. Now there's 2 other type of exposure tools that are not built in this camera, but if you have an external monitor, I don't know if you can see it, but it's right here that I'm using. This one comes with a really nice exposure tool, and it's called false color, and it can map out the different colors, and it's a fantastic tool for getting exposure set up really quickly. And there's also another thing called a waveform monitor, which if you buy some really expensive monitors, you can get a waveform monitor in it, and it'll give you a whole bunch of information of where in your image is being overexposed. Who knows, maybe in a further upgrade of this particular camera, they might actually address that and put false color in here, because that would be a fantastic addition to their tool set. And all the stuff that we've done here, we've done in the natural picture style. I don't want to actually talk about it too much yet, because we're going to have a whole chapter on things like Cine like D and Cine like V, which are totally different animals when it comes to exposure. So we're going to cover more about that later in a later chapter.